Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our presentation, Be Information Savvy, Learn to Spot Disinformation. I'm Barb Walter, a member of the Longmont Public Library's Adult Services team. With me here today are Kirsten Porman and Jana Kopp, also on the Adult Services team. And we, along with Josie Brockman, part of our team as well, put together this presentation to help you become a more savvy consumer of information, someone who's able to spot disinformation and has the tools to deal with it effectively. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. Please make sure your camera's off and that your mic is muted. Next, we welcome your questions and comments. Please use the chat function to capture those thoughts for us as we go. We'll have time for some Q&A at the end, and we'll respond to your questions and comments at that time. Just a heads up, though, we won't be able to analyze any specific websites or posts for you during the Q&A. And we do ask everyone to be kind and respectful in all their comments. And just for your information, we are recording this session. We will keep the chat as part of the recording, but we will make it anonymous, so don't worry about that. Thank you very much. Well, I think we'd all agree we live in a complex information environment these days. Information overload is real. We're inundated with so much info on a daily basis that it's difficult for us all to parse out high quality information from the not so high quality. As librarians and information professionals, we're often called on to find accurate, credible info for people, as well as to teach them how to identify it themselves, online and elsewhere. We're trained to think critically about how to evaluate a wide range of info sources for accuracy: books, articles, websites, news stories, blog posts, and so on. That is a big part of our job here. So we're excited to have the opportunity to share some of our tricks of the trade. We'll define disinformation for you and point out its pitfalls, talk about how and why it spreads so easily these days, show you how to spot it, and give you some tools to deal with it so as to minimize its negative impact on your life. So let's get started. First, a couple of terms to know: misinformation and disinformation. Take a moment to look at this photo and its headline. What is the message here? It appears someone's recently photographed a grocery store cold case, posted the photo, and observed that even during a pandemic, nobody's buying the vegan food. Turns out, though, this isn't the real story. This photo was originally taken and posted by someone in Texas in 2017 when stores got cleared out ahead of a hurricane. Then the photo was reposted in Australia early in the COVID-19 pandemic to make a joke about panic buying. Okay, I'll go on from here. So the photo you're looking at is a real photo, but the context doesn't fit. Now take a look at this headline. What's the message here? Does that title provoke you to react in a certain way? As a librarian and information professional, it certainly grabs my eyeballs. It makes me want to read further. Wow, National Public Radio says Americans have stopped reading? I'd better find out what's going on. It turns out, though, the writer's intent for this story is totally different from what the headline implies. And did you notice the date and the happy April Fool's Day? There we go. So what is disinformation? It's information put out into the world with an intent to deceive. People use disinformation to, among other things, make money, sow confusion, and gain political influence. It is malicious. This article from the Columbia Journalism Review describes how young, tech-savvy Macedonians in the run-up to the 2016 U.S. presidential election made thousands of dollars a month creating outlandish, totally falsified headlines and then posting them on sites like Facebook to sway public opinion here in the U.S. And by the way, that same article notes that the average monthly salary in Macedonia at that time was less than $450. So you can see there's a real, there's some money to be made in sowing confusion. How is misinformation different from disinformation? Well, it's the intent. Misinformation's intent is not malicious. It's people sharing information out of a desire to connect with others, but they don't realize that what they're sharing is false information. A good example of this would be your mom sharing an email with false content in it because she thinks that the information will protect you from something harmful. How then does disinformation or misinformation become dangerous? It's dangerous when it erodes our trust in trustworthy institutions, or in our democratic form of government, in good science, or in professional journalism. It can polarize and divide a community or even a whole society, and that makes it difficult for people within them to work together on shared goals or to solve shared challenges. Misinformation and disinformation can exacerbate inequalities in society. For example, it can be used to disenfranchise voters, discouraging them from exercising their right to participate in elections. And sadly, it can even turn deadly. This article tells how a Pakistani non-governmental organization created and posted a video as part of its anti-kidnapping campaign with good intent. But bad actors took that video, edited out the ending to make it appear like a real kidnapping, and then that new video went viral in India on WhatsApp. The video was circulated along with unsubstantiated claims that child traffickers were running loose in Indian cities, and this triggered mob attacks that left at least 24 innocent people dead. So how does disinformation spread so easily? First, it plays on our emotions. It can stir up anger, disgust, anxiety, even fear. Those gotcha posts can really spark an emotional response. Remember that "why don't Americans read anymore" story I mentioned earlier? That's a gotcha. And those emotions can cause us to act in ways we might not when we're thinking more rationally. We might like and share something before finding out, did it really happen? Is it really true? Second, disinformation may have a patina of credibility, a kernel of truth. It might be that a bit of the information is accurate, though the majority is false. This gives the information the appearance of being totally true and trustworthy. For example, a medical doctor who develops and sells a specially formulated medication or supplement to address a particular ailment may use their status as an MD to give a patina of credibility to some exaggerated claims for effectiveness made in ads for their product. When content is shared and seen over and over again, it starts to seem true, even if it isn't. Incredibly, this is true even for people who start out knowing that that information is false. Why does this happen? Well, it turns out our brains have a lot to process every day, and the brain loves to take shortcuts to make thinking more efficient. It'll skim over familiar-looking info that we see over and over. That way, we don't have to expend mental effort in looking at that information too closely. As humans, we tend to give more weight to information that upholds our pre-existing beliefs. Again, this is our brain taking a shortcut to save time. Imagine if we had to evaluate each new piece of information that comes our way in a day. Yet, with some information that we're consuming and considering sharing, we really should take that pause. Confirmation bias affects our decision making. We can't make good decisions if we ignore info that doesn't fit our views. We are largely unaware of this bias. Awareness that it is there is the first step toward better evaluation of info that comes our way. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and the like have quirks that we should all be aware of. One of them is bots. Social media bots are programs that vary in size depending on their function, capability, and design, and can be used on social media platforms to do various useful and malicious tasks while simulating human behavior. And that's the rub. You may think you're interacting with a human being on social media, when in reality, you've connected with a bot. On the upside, bots can facilitate company-to-customer relations when selling products or services. They can provide automated watching capabilities to capture breaking news. They can even encourage and heighten civic engagement and participation. But they can also foment hate speech, making subject matters appear to be gaining mainstream popularity. Or they can be used for harassment, as in overwhelming someone's account with so much activity to the point of deactivating it, shutting it down. The intentional spread of propaganda through bots can sway public opinion, limit free speech, even manipulate democratic processes and elections. Another quirk of social media platforms is the algorithm. Algorithms, simply put, are instructions used to solve a problem or complete a task. On social media platforms, algorithms prioritize which content a user sees in their feed first, by the likelihood that they'll actually want to see it. If you've ever been on YouTube, you've surely gotten recommendations for other videos to watch. I know I have. And those are based on your behavior. YouTube's algorithm digs into what you've watched in the past, adds in what users like you tend to watch, and then makes suggestions for you to watch next, all to keep you engaged in clicking on their website. All of that might sound pretty innocuous. Algorithms help you sift through tons of new content being published every minute online, and without it, sifting through all that content would be impossible. Algorithms are doing the legwork of delivering what you want and weeding out content that's irrelevant or of low quality. So what's the big deal about algorithms? Well, they're controversial for the impact on what you see, or more importantly, what you don't see in your social media feed. Since algorithms on social media sites prioritize content users see based on the likelihood that they'll want to see it, those algorithms can easily wind up creating what's called filter bubbles, where people only hear or see news and information online that supports what they already believe and like. Remember what I said about confirmation bias earlier? How we tend to give weight to info that supports our pre-existing beliefs? If all we see or hear on social media is news and information that supports what we already believe and like, we're likely to miss out on crucial information that could help us understand important issues, make better informed decisions, and appreciate viewpoints that differ from our own. At this point, Kirsten Portman is going to take over.
All right. So, hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten. I'm another one of the Adult Services librarians here. So we are going to talk about, now that we know where misinformation and disinformation kind of come from, what they look like, what they mean to us, okay, what do we do? So how do we spot it, and how can we think about that and protect ourselves? So the first thing we need to do is understand the content, which sounds simple, right? You know, read it, think about the words. But it's more complicated than that because there's so many different types of content and so many things that we see every day that understanding them can require a little more thought than we might be used to putting in. So the first kind of obvious example here is this even real news? So we all many of us probably are familiar with The Onion. Those of us who've been in Boulder County for a while might remember when The Onion was a print newspaper that hung out with the Times Call and the Daily Camera and could just, read at the coffee shop. And it's now a website and it's satirical news. And then as a real news example here, I've pulled the Associated Press. So I'm going to go ahead and share a web browser here and show you what those look like. So The Onion, sorry, minor technical difficulties here. Okay, The Onion, we're familiar with, we know it's satire, but what if we didn't? What if we just saw an article somebody shared on Facebook and we weren't familiar with the source of the news that it was coming from? We thought, I've never heard of that newspaper. What we can do is go to the article or go to the website for that news source and go to the About page, which pretty much every website has. It's either called About Us, about our organization, but it's usually going to have the word about. And when we go to The Onions, we might hope that it would say, this is satire. This isn't real. It doesn't. It says, The Onion is the world's leading news publication. It's been a print newspaper since 1756 with a daily readership of 4.3 trillion and is the single most powerful and influential organization in human history. So we might need to think critically about that for a minute. Is that possible? No. So it's satire, but we had to kind of think about it to see that. We can't just take The Onion's word for it. If instead we go look at the About page of the Associated Press, which is an international press organization, their About Us page has a lot, wants to give us cookies. It has a lot of information about them. It talks about the audience. It talks about who their staff is. Where is their coverage coming from? What we do, our story. So you'd have to, if you really wanted to know, as much as there was to know about this news source, you'd have to click through to these links. But this describes them being founded as an independent news cooperative made up of U.S. newspapers and broadcasters. So it is a US-based organization. That's important to know, right? We could learn more about their leadership team if we wanted to. So it's important, if you're not familiar with a source or what a source is, take a look at it. There are more and more satirical news sites that we haven't heard of, and we might not know off the top of our head that it wasn't real news, quote unquote real news. Check. If you're not familiar with the source, it's worth checking before you share or before you take that into your worldview. So now going back to our PowerPoint here. Sorry, just a moment. Okay. So that's real versus fake news, right? That's a pretty obvious thing to think about with content. But even in quote unquote, again, real news, there are, of course, biases. You have to think about who is speaking. Where is this information coming from? Because reporters are human beings, right? Media corporation owners are human beings. Editors are human beings. And we all have bias. It's not possible to not be biased. That's something that psychology has pretty much come to terms with at this point, and that Barb spoke about. So there are websites and organizations that are kind of out there to help us learn about that bias. And I think it's important to note here too, we all have bias. It's not an inherently bad thing, but it's something we need to be aware of and think about. And just know, am I hearing this because I agree with it? Does this suit my bias? Or do I not want to hear this because I'm biased against it? Or is this reporter saying this based on a bias? And maybe that's okay. It might still be true, but it's just something to know and think about. So this organization called All Sides, which we'll get you a link to at the end of the presentation, looks at media and looks at the bias of kind of all these media sources. So it will compare a source that people think of as being really right-leaning to a source that people think of as being really left-leaning. And it's not making value judgments. It's just fact-checking, comparing biases, talking about where these things are coming from, looking at things from quote-unquote all sides, which is difficult if not impossible, but we want to look at as many sides of an issue as we can, right, to make sure we're getting all of the relevant information. So even within these real news sources, again, what's the difference between factual reporting and opinion pieces, and how can we tell that difference? It's important to be aware that something on the New York Times website could very easily just be the opinion of one person who has name recognition and wrote an article, or not even an article, an editorial or an opinion piece for the New York Times. It doesn't mean it's factual reporting. Opinion pieces will be labeled. They'll be called editorials or opinion or an op-ed. But it's important to notice that because it's really easy to just see that, NewYorkTimes.com, CNN.com, DenverPost.com, and think, okay, this is a newspaper that I trust. What I'm reading here is true. I can just take this into my worldview. Double check, make sure that it's, reported news and that you're comfortable with where the facts are coming from. Because of course, there's value to editorials and opinion pieces or they wouldn't be there. But it is important to think about the difference. So with reported journalism, these are not opinion pieces. These are the headlines with a reporter's byline. Sometimes the byline will be from the Associated Press, which is one of the reasons that I pulled that up there as kind of a demonstration of a reliable news source. Journalists have a code of ethics that they are expected to follow. There's a whole long code of ethics. It's like multiple pages, but the main headings I've reproduced here for you: seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. We can kind of go into that a little bit. Seek truth and report it seems self-explanatory. Minimize harm, kind of the same thing. Doctors have a code of do no harm. This is one of the reasons that newspapers will do things like not publish photos of minors who are involved in a court case, things like that. Act independently would include, not being swayed by who owns your newspaper, things like that. And being accountable and transparent means citing your sources in as much as you can and just talking about where your information comes from. It should be possible for someone to fact check a journalism article. That's what the transparency is there. How can we do that? So I've talked so far about specifically news media, but this all really applies to any place you're getting your information. Newspapers, news on the internet, news on TV, something you heard on the radio or a podcast, video you saw on YouTube, something your Aunt Jane shared on social media, anything. We can apply these steps to any piece of information that we're getting, right? So the first thing that we need to do is step back. It's really easy. I mean, you're scrolling through Twitter, you're scrolling through Facebook, you're just taking in all of this information and it's just kind of finding its way into your brain, right? If it's something important or something that you are thinking about sharing or something that surprises you or something that you powerfully agree with, it makes sense to step back, take a look at what you're actually seeing. For me, I'm actually most likely, because of what I know about media and information, to step back and look at things that I really agree with. If I really want something to be true, I'm going to do a double check and make sure that it is. Because of that confirmation bias that Barb talked about, right? It's easy for us to just say, yeah, that sounds right. I'm going to tell everyone this is important. And that's a very understandable instinct that we all have. Back toward, early 2020, at the beginning of COVID lockdowns, those photos of swans and dolphins in the Venice canals went around. I thought that was so cool. I absolutely shared those photos. They had nothing to do with COVID. The swans always live in the canal, and the dolphins were photoshopped. I had to apologize to my Facebook friends for saying something that wasn't true. It happens, but I could have taken 30 seconds to Google that and not have had to apologize to my Facebook friends, right? So how do we do that? How can we make sure that what we're sharing and what we're taking into our worldview is as accurate as we can make it? The first thing is to think about things a little more critically than we might otherwise, and pictures are a great example, which is why I chose this one. So if we look at this chart, this height chart here, which, by the way, I did try to find a source for these average height information and I couldn't. So take the average height here with a grain of salt. What we're looking at is how they have manipulated the image. Look at the y-axis, which is the up and down vertical axis there. Look at where 5 feet starts and the distance from 0 to 5 versus the distance from 5 foot to 5 foot 1 inch. They've really truncated that axis, right? They've made it a lot shorter between 5 foot and 0 than the rest of it is. With the impact of making it look like women from Latvia are 3 times as tall as women from India. This is not true. I am of Latvian descent, and I can tell you this is not true. My grandmother was very tall. She was not that tall. And if you look at the numbers, right, it's only a difference of like 5 feet and 5 feet 5. It's a 5-inch difference, but look at what this image does. And now think about if this was financial information, if this was stock prices, or if this was health information, education information. It's really easy to make a chart look how you want it to look. It's important to look at the labels, look at what those numbers actually are. And if it's hard to tell, that can be a warning sign. Then we need to think about our reactions. My reaction, not gonna lie, to that picture on Twitter was to just start laughing. But the more I thought about it, I realized that this was a great example of how we can manipulate information. I didn't share that image with my friends as anything other than a funny joke. So how can we check that? And in this case, again, so if we really wanted to share that image, we would also want to make sure that those average heights were correct, right? Which I couldn't find. So that's something to think about. How would I look for those? So we have a lot of resources here. And we'll either get the links in the chat for you, or we might be able to send these out, or you can always contact us at the library to get, links and information to these, and we'll have our contact information here for you in just a minute. So PEN America is a nonprofit which is dedicated to freedom of information in all its forms. So talking about fact checking, they provided a lot of the base information for this webinar. They do a lot of training on spotting misinformation and the way that organizations and people manipulate information. FactCheckorg is a nonprofit fact-checking website. And you'll note that we noted nonprofit on a lot of these. That's a reasonably good indication that they aren't biased in the way that some media organizations can be. They're not owned by the same people as, the news companies and things like that. But, it's still one of those things. Everybody loves the phrase, do your own research, right? Doing your own research is hard. That's why, people have websites like this and organizations like this to help you do your own research, to make sure that you're getting the best information when you do your own research, right? And that's what we're here at the library for too, to help you with that research. We've got master's degrees in it. We are more than happy to help you figure out if something is accurate or help you find a place to look for accurate information. All right, back on topic. Snopes is another fact-checking website that you may have heard of. Some people love it, some people hate it. The nice thing about Snopes and what I would look for in any kind of fact-checking website is that they cite their sources. If they say that something is not true, they will link you to the places where they looked to find that out. If they say that it is true, they don't just say, yep, this is true. They say, this is true, and here is where we found that information. So it's great. You can make sure you are seeing what you wanted to see there. PolitiFact is very similar to FactCheck and Snopes, but it focuses solely on political information. So that's a really useful website during election time, especially. All Sides, we talked about earlier, talks about information bias in the news and gives you comparisons. Reporters Lab is a database of fact-checking sites. So if you really, aren't comfortable with Snopes, don't want to use FactCheck, there's many sites out there. First Draft is also another nonprofit dedicated to fighting misinformation, which tells you something in itself, right? We have all these nonprofits that have been formed around this issue because it's everywhere, and it's so easy to have this information just find its way into your algorithms, your filter bubble. It's all, there's all these headlines about social media and everything they're doing to try to combat this, which just shows you it's a problem. So there's all these organizations working to try to help us, which is great, but we have to seek them out. We have to do a little bit of work on our own. Ad Fontes Media makes the media bias chart that has circulated on social media a few times that you may have seen. It's a visual representation of where various media outlets fall on kind of a couple axes of bias. Something I want to point out with that, though, is the bias of an overall organization does not necessarily represent the bias of every opinion piece in that newspaper or on that channel or of every article. Because again, reporters are people, they're individuals. People writing opinion pieces are individuals, and they bring their own life experience and their own thoughts and their own bias to everything that they do, just like all of us do. NewsGuard is a browser extension that talks about website credibility, which is great if you're just doing Google searches. It'll give you a little, this website is this reliable, this website is not believed to be credible. Very helpful if you don't know where to start with a search. And then the News Literacy Project and the Decision Lab are more organizations that are kind of doing research around information consumption and trying to figure out how people make these decisions and take in this information. So with that, we can go ahead and take your questions. It's my ability to move.
Right. Thank you so much, Kirsten and Barb.
Enter your questions in the chat. You can type them in. Jana's going to read them for us so that they will appear on the recording, but the chat itself should not be visible on that recording. So that's why Jana's going to go ahead and read your questions. But just to keep everything organized and respectful of everyone's time, we're going to have you type those in the chat. We aren't going to be able to, again, just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're probably not going to be able to analyze specific websites or articles for you, but we are happy to do that at the library. I'll pop our contact information up here in just a minute. That's what we're here for. Call us, come to the reference desk, send us an email. We can help you figure out if something is reliable or where to get reliable information if you're not sure where to start. And then finally, of course, please keep everything in the chat respectful of everyone here, and go ahead and type your questions. Jana will read them. Here is our contact information to get in touch with us at the library. We've got our reference desk phone number here, and our email is askalibrarian@longmontcolorado.gov. There's also a link to that on our website if you're ever just looking for it. And usually you can come visit us at the reference desk on the second floor. We are going to be closed starting at the end of this week, so starting Friday. And so after Thursday night, the second floor of the library will be closed for a little while for some carpeting and construction work, but we will still be available by phone and by email during all of our usual business hours. And once we reopen, we welcome you to come visit us at the reference desk with any questions. Okay, do we have any questions yet, Jana?
Thanks so much, Kirsten and Barb. This is Jana. I am another librarian at the Longmont Public Library, and I'm just letting your presentation sink in with everyone, because sometimes it takes a little bit for the questions to percolate. So I don't have any questions yet, but I want to give everyone a minute to just kind of think about what they've heard, and if they do have any questions for us or any comments. I know that there's a lot going on in the world with misinformation and disinformation right now, so that, I've kind of been thinking a lot about that myself, and it's, it's kind of frightening right now. So please go ahead and type any questions that you do have for us into the chat function. I will read them.
Jana, while we're waiting for some questions to show up, I think I will go ahead and demonstrate a fun Google trick. The Google reverse image search, which I did touch on earlier in my presentation, and I'm happy to now demonstrate. So let me go ahead and share our web browser here again. So most of us are familiar here with this Google search page, right? This is where we start a lot of our information consumption, which is fine. It's totally great. Do be aware that Google has an algorithm just like social media does, and you're likely to get things that Google thinks you want to see. So you may need to dig deeper. But the other fun thing that Google can do is this reverse image search. So I'm going to actually pull up our City of Longmont webpage here, because I know that I can find an image that will exist on other websites. So our Parks Department has some good ones, I think. Yeah. So we found this picture somewhere, and in this case, I'm just going to use this picture of dandelions here. But this is what I did. This is where I started to try and find sources for that height data. I plugged that picture of that height chart into this search and tried to see where it had originated. As far as I can tell, it may have originated with that tweet. But this would have been a good way to find the data if it existed. So what we do here, what we can do is if we right click on the photo, we can copy the image link. Okay, so everything on a website has a link that identifies what it is, basically. And if I go over here to Google Images, which to get there from this Google page, you click here on Images on the right-hand corner. We click on the little camera and paste the image URL. So we just paste it in there, what we just copied. Search. And Google is going to show me every other website that uses this piece of art. So this is free clip art. It's on quite a few other websites. The freedictionary.com uses it for their dandelion definition here. But think about, this has a lot of other applications. Something that, you may have seen in the news recently is that this is really common in wartime or in conflicts. An image of one conflict gets used as an image of a new conflict, but it might actually be a few years old. Barb's example earlier of the grocery store photo. This is how I figured out, that's how I found that photo too, and found that it had been shared more than once in more than one context. So really useful, just a nice, fun Google trick. There are a lot of these, but that's one that can be really handy, especially in times right now. Pictures are really used to try and manipulate emotions.
All right. Well, thank you, Kirsten. I actually did not know that before I did this presentation with you, and that is a really clever thing to know about. So thank you for that. And we did get some questions in the meantime. First question is, how do you use FactCheck?
FactCheck.org, is that what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see if we can go to it. I bet we can. Yeah. So let's see, can you see that? Is that showing up on everyone's screens, the FactCheck.org website? Maybe. I'll hope that it is. So this is FactCheck.org. It's got a lot of options for you here. You can look by topic. You can see it's got all of the things that people are likely to want to fact check. It also has, you can specifically contact them. They've got a whole page called Debunking False Stories. So that's if you went over here under articles, fact check posts, debunking, all of that. But what you're probably going to want to use most is just the search button here. And you literally can just type in the topic that you're looking for. So whatever it is that you're curious about, something that you're seeing all over Facebook that doesn't sound quite right, type it in, and it'll pull that up for you. So hopefully that helped.
All right, thank you. The next question is, do you have newspapers that you would recommend?
Not specifically. Everybody kind of has their own favorite newspapers. Local press is actually someplace that a lot of people will look. So that, our local papers would be, Daily Camera, Times Call. There's also the Longmont Leader, which is a free local paper. But everybody has their favorites, and, they're all fine. There's not a newspaper that we can sit here and say, you never need to double check anything that you hear in this paper. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist because they all have opinion pieces. Reporters make mistakes, things slip by editors, or people learn new information after the fact. And they do publish retractions and corrections, but you may never see that. The New York Times gets something wrong. They are going to come out in their next issue or a couple issues later and say, hey, we got this wrong. But that doesn't help me if I read it last week and I don't read it this week. So, those big newspapers are all perfectly good newspapers. The Denver Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the USA Today. I'm just listing things that we have in the library. And they're all good. And you actually do, if you have a library card, You have access to the New York Times and the Washington Post online, unlimited, with your library card. We're happy to help you figure that out. And that's just because those are the papers that offer that option for libraries. It's not necessarily an endorsement, but it is a great place to start if you're looking for news.
It's a great reminder that we do have those. And then, of course, we have a bunch of papers that you can come in and read in person. And we do save the back issues of our local paper for quite a while, and we have it on microfilm as well. So the next question, which of these fact-checking sites offers the most neutral, apolitical research?
I would say that this is Barb again, and great question, by the way. As far as neutral and apolitical, I think, again, we'll just stress what our main message is here, that we all need to go into a news, for consumers of information, we have to be savvy about it. We've got to realize that there is bias no matter where you go. I have a personal favorite. I like reading stories from various angles by going to All Sides. That website puts the actual story up and then gives you three different views, a right-leaning organization, a left-leaning, and then somebody in the center. And one of the wonderful things about that is that you can actually see the difference in the way the same story is covered. And you might begin to notice choices of words, what kinds of sources get quoted, what kinds of points get made without any substantive support. And those are kind of clues to look out for. So no matter what fact-checking or news source you go to, have your eyes wide open and read everything with a sense of, as Kirsten has reminded us, that everybody's got a bias. Everybody makes mistakes in reporting the news. And that to me is kind of the best filter to have on, no matter where you get your news.
Which is not to say, of course, that you can't believe, anything you read. We don't want you to leave this webinar with the feeling that you just can't find good information on the internet. That's not true. You really can. You really, really can. But you just have to, have that filter going in your brain. Have that "this doesn't sound right" filter, or "this sounds really, really good" filter. Because those are the two things that you just might want to double check. And then the other thing I'll note is it's Ad Fontes Media that's linked here. They are one of those, they've made that media bias chart, and they have an in-depth description of how they did that research and how they defined that, which again, go to that about page on even a fact-checking website. That about page should tell you how they make their decisions, and that's important. You want to know. So I realized that we were really emphasizing everybody is biased, and that is true. We all are, and we should be aware of that, and we should think about that when we take in information. But it really is possible to find good and accurate information in the media, on the internet, on TV news, wherever you're getting it from. It is out there. It does exist. We don't want to make you think that you just can't find it and you should give up.
Yes, and I will read any more questions that do appear. It looks like there are a couple more questions. One question is regarding the transcript or the recording of this presentation, which, yes, we will be posting the recording of the presentation, including the questions that we've discussed verbally. And that will be under our library programming page. So if you go to the home page and you go to the left-hand menu, you'll see programs. You can go in there and click on watch a recent program. So you can look for that in the coming week or so. We'll try to get that up for you as well. And then the other question is, how do you access the newspapers with our library card? And I think you're talking about the digital papers. And that is under, I believe, if you go to the left-hand menu on the homepage under e-reading, I believe, you'll see the information on how to access the New York Times digitally, as well as the Washington Post. Let me know if I didn't answer your question. And if there are any final questions, we welcome them now. And again, we are librarians at the Longmont Public Library, so we are there. You are welcome to call us or email us if you do need assistance accessing the paper or whatever it is. So we did get one final question. All the main news, cable, and otherwise seem obviously biased left or right. How do you decide which is true, which is news and not op-ed?
Okay, so that is a big question. And it relates to the fact that we all have our own biases too. And we will tend to attribute more positive feelings toward people that agree with us. That's pretty natural. That's kind of how human beings developed to have social groups, and that's okay. But as a result, we are going to see the bias in everything else. And I think Barb kind of hit the nail on the head when she talked about, going to all sides and reading articles from multiple directions. Because a lot of times at base, you're going to find the information is the same and the way they talk about it is different. Find that overlap. Find that information that's the same. And the other thing is, numbers. You'll see statistics in a lot of articles. And if you can find where those statistics came from, if you're seeing 5 sources have this, I'm going to just make something up. 5 sources say 25% of librarians prefer dogs over cats. And one source says, actually, 75% of librarians prefer dogs over cats. Well, where did that one source get that completely opposite information? And I'm not saying, majority rules is always going to be the way to go. But if almost every source is saying one thing and there's a couple saying something else, there's often a reason for that. And we like the underdog, right? Especially if I agree with them. If those 2 sources say what I wanted to hear, I really want librarians to like dogs because the stereotype is that we like cats. I might look at those 2 sources and think, yeah, that sounds more right. But it would be a good idea for me to think about why so many other sources were saying something different and maybe try to get to the root of where that information came from, which if they're being transparent and journalistically ethical, right, we should be able to do. So if it's labeled as opinion, it's opinion. If it's not labeled as opinion, but doesn't sound right, or it sounds too good to be true, check a couple other sources, check all sides, check fact check. But it's tough. You're right. It's tough. And the biggest thing is to just know that just because a source might lean one way or the other doesn't mean the information is bad, especially if you can find another source for that information.
Great. Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, there's one more question. At the White House press conference, how does one fact check the information? How do you fact check the information at a White House press conference?
Sure. And it depends on the information. If it's science numbers, maybe we go look at the World Health Organization website, or the National Institutes of Health has a great public-facing website called Medline Plus. If it's economic numbers, that could be harder. If you really want to dig deep, most of those economic reports are actually available either on whitehouse.gov or, if you do a Google search. So usually if they're quoting numbers, there's a source somewhere. You may have to dig a little bit. We'd like to hope we can, believe the information that's coming out of our elected officials. And that kind of goes back to what Barb talked about with misinformation eroding trust. We want to assume that things that don't sound right to us or that we disagree with aren't correct or are biased. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's not. But there's typically a source if they're presenting something as factual information. Those numbers have to come from somewhere. So finding the source of those numbers is a great place to start. And again, just looking at, it's a presidential press conference, every news source, every media source is probably going to pick up at least the highlights. They fact check. They will tell you. And, don't just count on one source to fact check it, especially if it's a source that may be biased either in the same or a different direction. But look at a couple different sources and see what people are saying. And that's kind of where to start. And that's true for any press conference. That's true for your favorite sports team having a press conference, a politician having a press conference, a police chief having a press conference, an actor. I'm just listing people that have press conferences now, but I just want to make the point that this applies across the board. You can always check the sources that people are using.
Yes, thank you, Kirsten. If feel free to add any more questions. We have a few more minutes, but if not, I think I will wrap up now unless anyone wants to add a final question. We do thank you for attending this evening. And I want to thank Kirsten and Barb for all of their research and time putting together this presentation. And thank you to Josie, who is our chair for the programming committee, for helping us do the presentation tonight. There is one more question here. What do you think are some good ways to prevent social media from propagating disinformation?
Okay. I think it's in the nature of the beast that, as I explained, there's a lot of, it's just so easy to spread misinformation and disinformation based on the way the social media is set up. The social media platforms are generally set up to keep you engaged, keep you clicking, keep you scrolling. And those same algorithms, those same tools that they're using to keep you engaged, unfortunately, can function in a negative fashion and be really easy ways for misinformation and disinformation to slip into the stream. And if you're not aware that that is out there and that that's how social media functions, you can easily trip up and start sharing things. Like Kirsten said, I was really thrilled with those swan pictures in the Venice canals too, myself. But yeah, it just seems to be part of their structure at this point. And as far as how to fix it, I really don't know.
Yep, which is why the best we can do might be at this point to check what we share, you know, and at least not be another link in the chain. But Barb is right. That's a bigger question than we can answer because that comes down to how do tech companies work? How do algorithms work? How do profits work? So it's a tough one, but we can check what we share and we can try not to share anything that isn't accurate.
Yeah, this is Jana, and I personally have some concerns about Facebook, and it's something that you can do is to withdraw the time you spend on Facebook because we know that they do propagate disinformation, and they have other disturbing practices. So, you know, taking a Facebook boycott, I would say, is another thing that one could do. If there aren't any more questions, I want to thank everyone for attending. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening and come visit us in the library.